The moment Harvey Graves rode into Calico Flats, New Mexico territory, in the spring of 1882, every man on the main street found something urgent to stare at on the ground. He came in slow, the way a man does when he has nothing to prove and everything to lose, his roan horse picking its way through the red dust like it knew this particular stretch of earth was not entirely safe. Harvey sat tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low over a face that was neither young nor old but somewhere in the burned-out middle, that happens to a man who has been through things he does not discuss over supper. His coat was dark and his boots were worn through at the heel, and there was a rifle scabbard on his saddle, but nobody was looking at the rifle. They were looking at his face, or rather they were not looking at his face, which amounted to the same thing. The name had come ahead of him, the way names do in territories where the telegraph wire hums with gossip and the bartenders know things before the sheriff does. Harvey Graves. It passed between people in Calico Flats the way a man passes a coal from one pipe to another, quick and without much show, but leaving a burn behind. Nobody said it outright. Nobody pinned it to a sentence in front of company. But everybody in that town of 400 souls knew the name, and knowing it made their eyes find the dust, the sky, the water trough, anything that was not the man riding down the center of their street. He had been many things before he arrived in Calico Flats. He had been a cattle driver out of Texas, which was respectable. He had been a deputy in a town called Redfield that no longer existed as a town, which was complicated. He had been involved in a matter concerning a man named Cord Ashby and a disputed land claim that involved 3 dead men, and a federal hearing that ultimately cleared Harvey Graves of wrongdoing, but left the kind of smoke that lingers in the air long after the fire is done. Men looked at that smoke and made their decisions. They decided not to say his name aloud, as if the name itself were a thing that could catch. Harvey did not care much about this, or he told himself he did not care much about this, which is a different thing altogether. He tied the roan outside Farley's general store and went inside to buy cornmeal and coffee and a new pair of bootlaces, because the old ones had snapped 2 days back, and he had been making do with a length of leather cord that was not quite long enough. He set his goods on the counter and waited. Farley himself was a wide man with a red face and small hands that moved too quickly for a man of his size, and he looked at Harvey's goods and then at the wall just behind Harvey's left ear, which was a trick men had developed when they needed to conduct business with someone they were afraid to acknowledge properly. "That will be 32 cents, Farley said to the wall. Harvey set the coins down without a word. He was turning to leave when the door opened, and the morning light came in around a woman who moved like she had somewhere to be, and was not particularly worried about whether anyone approved of her pace. She was carrying a flour sack over one shoulder, and a list folded twice in her left hand, and she stepped around Harvey with the easy confidence of a woman who had been navigating a small town for long enough that she knew where every inch of ground was located. Then she stopped. She looked at him, which was already unusual. She looked at him the way you look at something you are actually trying to see, not the way people had been looking at everything except him all morning. "You are Harvey Graves," she said. It was not a question. And she said the name the way you say the name of someone you have been expecting, not the name of something dangerous. She said it straight out, without flinching, without dropping her eyes to the dust, without finding something urgent on the other side of the room. She said Harvey Graves the way you say good morning, and something cracked open inside him that he had not known was sealed shut. He stood very still. "I am," he said. "I am Della Grayson," she said. "I run the boarding house on Sutter Lane. You will need a room, I expect, if you are staying in Calico Flats." "I may be staying," he said. "Then you should come by this afternoon," she said. "I have one room left and it has a decent window. I charge $2 a week, and that includes supper but not the noon meal." She shifted the flour sack on her shoulder and looked at him a beat longer than was strictly necessary for a business exchange. "You look like you could use a supper or two," she added, and there was no pity in it, only the plain observation of a woman who was accustomed to assessing things accurately. Then she turned to Farley and asked for her flour and her dried beans and a pound of salt pork, and Harvey Graves walked out into the morning with a name that felt, for the first time in a long while, like something he was allowed to carry. Della Grayson was 27 years old and had been running the Grayson boarding house for 4 years, since her father, Ellis Grayson, had died of a chest ailment in the winter of 1878 and left her the building, 2 horses, a modest savings in a tin box under the floorboards of the kitchen, and the complete absence of any other family to speak of. She had a brother somewhere in Colorado, a man named Titus who wrote letters at Christmas and did not appear otherwise, and she had grown up in the territory and knew it the way you know something you have never been anywhere else long enough to compare. She knew the red earth and the wide sky, and the way the heat pressed down in July like a hand on the back of your neck. She knew which men were decent and which were not, because in a territory town of 400 people you learn this the way you learn the sound of your own door in a wind. You know it without having to think. She had known about Harvey Graves for 2 weeks before he arrived. Walt Purdy, who ran the telegraph office and had the unfortunate habit of sharing information he was technically supposed to keep to himself, had told her in the manner of a man who was simultaneously warning her and waiting to see what she would do with the warning. He told her about the Redfield business and Cord Ashby and the 3 dead men and the federal hearing, watching her face for the flinch. Della had listened to the whole thing and then said, "Was he cleared?" Walt had blinked. "The hearing cleared him, yes, but then he is a man who came through something hard and survived it," Della had said, which is a description that fits half the territory. Walt had left the conversation looking vaguely dissatisfied, and Della had gone back to airing out the linen in the spare room, because the spare room always smelled of cedar and closed air when it had been unused for a while. Harvey came to the boarding house that afternoon, as she had instructed. He came with his saddlebags over one shoulder and his hat in his hand, which told her something. Men who take their hats off at a door are men who were raised to be polite, and who have not entirely abandoned the habit no matter what happened afterward. She showed him the room, which was on the 2nd floor and had a window that looked out over the small yard and the cottonwood tree that Ellis Grayson had planted when Della was a girl, and that had grown tall enough to provide shade in summer and a wonderful sound of rattling leaves when the autumn wind came through. Harvey stood at the window for a moment and looked at the cottonwood. "That is a good tree," he said. "My father planted it," she said. "I was about 4 years old." He said every house needed something growing beside it to know it was a home, and not just a building. Harvey turned from the window and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something layered and careful, like a man who has learned to keep things below the surface. "That is a true thing," he said quietly. He took the room. He was quiet for the first several days in the way that men are quiet when they are testing whether a place is safe, not dangerous safe but livable safe, whether the soil of a place will hold them without throwing them off. He came down for supper and sat at the long table with the other boarders, who were a schoolteacher named Edmund Price, who was thin as a fence post and talked about history at length, and a widow woman named Mrs. Coralie Baxter, who was visiting her daughter and had opinions about everything and stated them freely, and a traveling dry goods salesman named Porter Finn, who arrived on Tuesdays and departed on Thursdays and told jokes that were better suited to a saloon than a supper table, but told them anyway with great enthusiasm. None of them said Harvey's name at the table, the first few nights. They spoke around him the way you speak around a gap in the fence, acknowledging the gap exists by walking around it. But Harvey did not seem troubled by this. He ate Della's biscuits and the beef stew she made on Wednesdays with the dried peppers and the potatoes from the root cellar, and he said please and thank you and passed the salt without being asked when he noticed someone reaching for it. On the 4th evening, Edmund Price asked, without quite looking up from his plate, whether Harvey had ever been to Santa Fe. Harvey said he had, some years back, passing through. Edmund asked what he had seen there. Harvey described the plaza and the old adobe church and the market stalls, and he did it with the specific detail of a man who actually looks at things rather than walking through them. And Edmund Price set down his fork and turned to look at Harvey directly for the first time and said, "You have a good eye." "I pay attention," Harvey said. After that, the table warmed. Mrs. Baxter decided to have opinions about Harvey Graves the same way she had opinions about everything, which meant that she declared him a fine-looking man in a voice that carried clearly to Harvey himself, who had the grace to look at his biscuit while it happened. Porter Finn told his saloon jokes, and Harvey laughed at two of them with a sudden ease that surprised Della, who had been watching from the kitchen doorway without being entirely aware that she was watching. She was aware of him. She had been aware of him since the morning in Farley's store in a way that was separate from her awareness of the other boarders, a different quality of attention that she could not entirely account for, and did not spend a great deal of time trying to account for because she was a practical woman and she had a boarding house to run. But she noticed him. She noticed that he rose before dawn and went to the yard to work the stiffness out of his back, which was the back of a man who had spent years in a saddle, and she sometimes heard him out there in the blue, early light through her kitchen window while she was building the fire for breakfast. She noticed that he came back from wherever he went during the days. She learned eventually that he had taken on work at the Dempsey Ranch east of town, helping with the spring fence repairs, and that he washed his hands at the pump outside with a thoroughness that suggested he did not like to carry the day's dirt indoors. She noticed that he read, which was not common, and that he had a worn book of poetry in his coat pocket that she saw him take out once while sitting on the porch steps in the evening, though he closed it quickly when he heard her come out. On the 8th day of his stay, she came out with 2 cups of coffee at the hour when the sky turned the color of a bruise fading to gold and sat on the step beside him, 1 step down so they were nearly level, and handed him a cup. He took it and said, "Thank you." She said, "What are you reading?" He was quiet a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and held out the book. The spine said it was a collection of poems by Walt Whitman, and the pages had been read enough times that the binding had gone soft. "My mother's," he said. "She liked Whitman." "Where is your mother?" Della asked because she was a direct woman and had found that indirect questions mostly produced indirect answers which were less useful. "Died in 1874, Harvey said. "East Texas, fever." "I am sorry," Della said. "My mother died when I was 12, childbirth, the baby too." "That is a hard thing to carry," he said. "It is what I had," she said. "I carried it." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable, which was itself unusual. Most silences between two people who do not know each other well are full of the effort of filling them. This one simply sat there between them like the evening itself, easy and wide. "Can I ask you something?" Della said. "You can ask," he said, which was different from saying yes, and she noticed the distinction. "The business in Redfield," she said. "I know what Walt Purdy told me, which is probably close to what most people here know, but Walt Purdy does not always have the entire picture of a thing. I wondered if you wanted to tell me your version." Harvey turned the coffee cup in his hands. He looked at the cottonwood tree in the yard, where the early stars were beginning to show above its highest branches. "Cord Ashby ran a land operation," he said at last. "He would claim land that belonged to families, mostly families who did not have proper title papers, which in the territory in those years was most families who had been there a long time. He had a man in the land office and a man who could make papers. I was the deputy. I found out what was happening and I told the sheriff, whose name was Brent Loader, and Loader told me to leave it alone because Ashby had money and friends and the kind of reach that makes sheriffs careful." He paused. "I did not leave it alone." Della said nothing, only waited. "There was a confrontation," Harvey said. "Ashby had 3 men. I had a badge and I was in the right, but neither of those things stops a bullet, and I was fortunate. 2 of his men drew and I put them down, and the 3rd ran and Ashby was taken in. The hearing cleared me because the law was clear and I had witnesses. But Ashby had more friends than enemies in the territory, and by the time the hearing was done, the town of Redfield had made it plain enough that a man who had killed two of their own, even their own being hired guns working an illegal land scheme, was not a man they particularly wanted living among them. He looked at her. So I left. I have been leaving places for a few years now. Della looked back at him steadily. And you came here. I came here, he said. Well, she said, and stood up with her coffee cup. Calico Flats is not Redfield. I cannot speak for every person in this town, but I can speak for this house, and you are not a man who needs to be leaving on my account. She went back inside and left him sitting on the step, and Harvey Graves sat there in the darkening evening and felt something shift in his chest, something long calcified beginning, very slowly, to soften. He began talking to her more deliberately after that. Not always about large things. The evenings were full of the ordinary conversation of a household. The fence post that needed replacing at the back of the yard, the way the spring had come earlier than usual, and what that might mean for the summer water supply, whether Edmund Price's chalk consumption was reaching levels that should concern anyone. But underneath the ordinary talk there was something building, the way a river builds under the ice in February, present and powerful, and pushing toward the moment when the surface gives way. He helped her without being asked. He noticed that the gate to the chicken yard had a hinge that was failing, and he fixed it one Saturday morning before she had gotten to it on her list. He noticed that the wood she was cutting for the stove was taking longer than it should because the axe blade needed sharpening, and he sharpened it. He did these things without announcement, and she noticed them in the same quiet way, and she thanked him in the same quiet way, and neither of them made a production of it because something that is real does not need a production. 3 weeks into his stay, trouble arrived in Calico Flats in the form of a man named Burl Cott. Burl Cott was not from the territory. He was from Arizona, from a settlement near the border where a certain kind of man operated outside the law with a confidence that suggested he had never been meaningfully opposed. He had 3 men with him when he rode in, hard-faced men who wore their guns low, and had the particular stillness of men who were comfortable with violence. They took rooms at the Calhoun Hotel, which was the only other rooming establishment in Calico Flats, and within a day the word was moving through town that Burl Cott had an interest in several of the surrounding ranches, the kind of interest that was not friendly. The Dempsey Ranch was among them. Harvey heard this at the ranch when old Thomas Dempsey came in from town, looking like a man who had aged 5 years in an afternoon. Thomas Dempsey was 61, with a son named James who ran the day-to-day operations, and he had built his ranch over 30 years of hard work and worse weather. And now there was a man in town claiming to have a document suggesting that a portion of Dempsey land ran across a disputed territory boundary and was therefore subject to a land grant that Cott had purchased from a man in Tucson. Harvey recognized the shape of this immediately. He had seen it in Redfield. He had seen what happened when you ignored it. He told Thomas Dempsey exactly what it was, and Thomas Dempsey looked at him with the eyes of a man who was afraid but had not yet decided to be a coward. "What do I do?" Thomas asked. "First thing," Harvey said, "is find your original title documents and get them to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. Send James with them, fast as he can ride. Second thing is do not let Cott onto your land for any reason. Third thing is do not start a fight in town, because that is what he wants. He wants an incident that puts you on the wrong side of the law while he holds the paper." James Dempsey rode for Santa Fe the next morning. Harvey stayed on at the ranch, not because Thomas asked him to, but because he had the particular knowledge for this particular situation and leaving felt wrong. He told Della that evening at supper. The table was unusually quiet because word had spread and even Porter Finn's jokes had deserted him tonight. "This man Cott," Della said carefully, her hands flat on the table. "Is he the same manner of man as Cord Ashby?" Harvey looked at her. "Near enough." Then you know how it ends, she said. I know how it went last time, he said. I'm hoping this time goes differently. Differently how, Mrs. Baxter asked, leaning forward with the intensity of a woman who had spent 70 years paying attention. Differently meaning with lawyers and paper and the land office, and not with guns, Harvey said. The territory has more law in it than it did 10 years ago. That is worth something. The table seemed to breathe a little. That night Della found Harvey on the porch again, later than usual, the stars very bright above the cottonwood. She came out with the coffee pot and a single lamp, and she sat on the step beside him again, closer than before, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. You are worried, she said. I am thinking, he said. About Cot. About what I do if this goes the way it went in Redfield, he said. I'm not a deputy anymore. I have no badge. I have no authority except what a man has by virtue of being a man who will not look away. Sometimes that is enough authority, Della said. He looked at her in the lamplight, and something passed between them that was not entirely about Burl Cott or the Dempsey Ranch or the history of men looking away from things they ought not to look away from. It was a different kind of looking, direct and soft at the same time, the kind of looking that costs something. You are not afraid of me, he said. It came out like something he had been turning over and was only now saying aloud. No, she said simply. Most people here know a name and a story with the details filed off, she said. I know the man who sharpened my axe and fixed my gate and eats supper at my table and reads Walt Whitman on the porch steps and told Thomas Dempsey how to protect what is his. She met his eyes. I am not afraid of that man. Harvey Graves was quiet for a long time. The cottonwood moved in a small wind. Della, he said, and the way he said her name was the way a man says something he has been holding carefully, setting it down with intention. Yes, she said. I do not know how long I am staying in Calico Flats. I know, she said. But I find that I want to be staying, he said, longer than I have wanted to stay anywhere in a good while. Della looked at the yard, at the dark shapes of the garden beds and the chicken yard and the cottonwood tree her father had planted. Then stay, she said. See how the land feels under your feet when you stop thinking about leaving. He did not say anything more that night, but when she stood to go inside he stood too, and he held the door for her with a care that was entirely out of proportion to the smallness of the gesture, and she felt it. She thought about it long after she had blown out her lamp and the house was dark and quiet. James Dempsey returned from Santa Fe 11 days later with good news and complicated news. The good news was that the Dempsey title was sound, and the land office had confirmed that the boundary claim Cott was using was based on a fraudulent survey document. The complicated news was that the territorial land office was backlogged, as it was always backlogged, and the formal ruling would not come for several weeks, and in the meantime Burl Cott was still in Calico Flats and still making his presence known. He had begun pressuring other ranchers in the area. There were 4 smaller operations to the south and west of Dempsey land, families who had less clear title and less money to send men to Santa Fe, and Cott had been visiting them. He visited politely, which was its own kind of threat, the politeness of a man who wants you to understand that he is choosing not to use the other thing he has available. The Calico Flats sheriff, a man named Ray Holt, was a decent man in a difficulty. He was the sheriff of a town of 400 people, and he had a deputy who was 22 years old and enthusiastic, and this was almost certainly a situation that required more than enthusiasm. Ray Holt knew Harvey Graves was in town. He knew about Redfield. He came to the boarding house one evening and sat at the supper table and ate Della's stew and then asked Harvey to walk with him. They walked down Sutter Lane in the evening and Ray Holt said, I could use a man who knows this kind of operation. Harvey said, I am not a lawman anymore. I know, Ray said. I am not asking you to be a lawman. I am asking you to be a man who knows how this works and who is willing to stand with the people it is being worked on. Harvey was quiet for a half block. You know what they say about me, he said. I know what happened in Redfield, and I know the hearing cleared you, and I know what kind of man does what you did in Redfield, and I know what kind of man does not, Ray said plainly. I am asking the kind of man who does. Harvey looked at the dark street and the lit windows and the shape of Calico Flats at night, which was ordinary and small and trying to be a place where people could live decent lives. All right, he said. He went to Della before he went asleep that night, and he told her what Ray Holt had asked and what he had agreed to. And he told her because it felt important that she know. Because in the 3.5 weeks he had been in Calico Flats, she had become the person whose opinion of his actions mattered most to him, which was itself a remarkable thing to realize. Della listened with her hands folded on the kitchen table and her eyes on him. Be careful, she said when he finished. Not because I think you are reckless, but because I find I have opinions about whether you come home at night. The word home landed between them, and neither of them moved for a moment. Harvey said, I will be careful. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly over his, just a moment, warm and certain, and then she took it back and stood up and said she was going to check on the bread she had rising by the stove. Harvey sat at the table for another minute, feeling the warmth on the back of his hand like something that had taken up residence there. The situation with Cot came to its head in the second week of June, 6 weeks after Harvey had ridden into Calico Flats. Cot had taken to riding out to the smaller ranches himself, with his 3 men, and the visits had stopped being polite. A family named Ferris, who ran a modest operation with 2 grown sons and a daughter-in-law and 3 grandchildren, had been told in plain language that their claim was disputed, and that it would be in their interest to sell at the price Cot named or face a legal fight they could not afford. The Ferris patriarch, a man named Edwin who was 68 and had the hands of a man who had worked his land for 3 decades, had come into town with a face that had the gray color of a man who has received very bad news. Harvey went with Ray Holt to the Ferris ranch the next day. They took Cot's men by surprise. Cot's men were in the yard, and Cot himself was inside with Edwin Ferris, making his offer in the privacy of the house, which Harvey recognized as a tactic, the isolation of the principal party from witnesses and backup. Ray Holt had sent word ahead, and Harvey had written a letter to the territorial governor's office in Santa Fe the previous week, laying out the pattern of Cot's operation across the 5 affected ranches, cross-referencing the fraudulent survey document the Dempsey title investigation had already identified, and noting the names and descriptions of Cot's associates. That letter had gone express, which was expensive, and Harvey had paid for it himself. At the Ferris ranch, Cot came out of the house with a smile that was meant to communicate the confidence of a man who holds all the cards. Sheriff, Cot said pleasantly. Burl Cot, Ray Holt said. I am going to need you to accompany me back to town, you and your men. On what grounds? Cot asked, still pleasant, but the smile had shifted slightly. On the grounds that I have a report of harassment and intimidation on private property, Ray Holt said. And on the grounds that the survey document your land claims are based on has been identified as a fraud by the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. The smile went away entirely. What followed was tense but ultimately not violent, because Ray Holt was steady and Harvey stood beside him with the particular quality of stillness that comes from a man who has been in these moments before and knows that it is the stillness and not the motion that often determines the outcome. Cot's men looked at each other and looked at Harvey, and made the calculation that men in that position make when they realize the other side has more than they thought. Cot and his men rode into Calico Flats under escort. The arrest held because the documentation was solid, and the territorial marshal arrived from Albuquerque 4 days later. A man named Gordon Sykes, who had encountered Cot's type of operation before and was not gentle in his handling of it. Burl Cot and his 3 associates were taken to Albuquerque to await trial. The fraudulent survey document was confirmed. The affected ranches received letters from the land office affirming their claims, and Edwin Ferris shook Harvey Graves's hand in the street in front of 12 people and said, loud enough for all of them to hear, "You are a good man, Harvey Graves." There was a silence in the street, a very brief one. And then Thomas Dempsey, who had come to town for supplies, said, "He is that," and that was the end of the silence. Harvey stood in the street with his name hanging in the open air of Calico Flats, said aloud by two men who meant it, and it did not feel like a coal passed from hand to hand, a thing too dangerous to hold. It felt like a name, just a name. His name. A thing a man could carry without burning. He found Della at the boarding house when he came back. She was in the garden, on her knees with her hands in the earth, planting the summer squash she had been waiting to put in until the last frost risk had passed. Her hair was coming loose from its pins, and there was a streak of earth on her cheek, and she looked up when she heard him come through the gate. She took one look at his face and read it. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him for a long moment with the afternoon sun behind him. "Come here," she said. He went to her, which meant crouching down in the garden bed beside her, which was not what either of them had expected but was exactly right. The two of them at the level of the earth she was working, close enough that he could see the exact color of her eyes, which were a warm brown with a ring of gold at the center that he had been noticing for weeks without allowing himself to look directly at for this long. "Edwin Ferris said it in the street," he said. "Said my name. Said it out loud." Della smiled, and it was the kind of smile that comes from the chest rather than just the mouth, the kind that arrives with its full weight. "Good," she said. "You have a fine name." It does not deserve to be whispered. Harvey Graves, who had been broken open in Farley's general store 6 weeks ago by the simple act of a woman saying his name without flinching, felt the thing that had cracked open then continue to open now, the way a door opens fully after being only barely ajar, letting in all the light. He reached out and brushed the streak of earth from her cheek with his thumb, and his hand stayed against her face for a moment, and she did not pull away. "Della," he said. "Harvey," she said back, and the symmetry of it, each of them saying the other's name, was something neither of them would forget. He kissed her. It was soft and it was certain, and it tasted like the afternoon and the spring garden, and the particular kind of relief that comes when something you have been careful about for a very long time is finally allowed to be itself. Her hand came up and covered his hand at her cheek, and they stayed like that in the garden with the squash seedlings and the afternoon light and the sound of the cottonwood in the wind above the fence. When they came apart, she was looking at him with the clear directness that was entirely her, no performance, no coyness, just Della Grayson looking at something she had decided to look at. "I want to say something," she said. "Say it," he said. "I have been running this house and this life by myself for 4 years, and I am not in any distress about it," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not asking you to fix anything or save anything or stay because I need you to." "I know," he said. "But," she said, and the but was gentle, "I would like it very much if you stayed. Not because I need it, because I want it, because I like the man you are. I like talking to you, and I like that you read poetry and fixed the hinge on the chicken yard gate. I like the way you are with people, and I like that you told Thomas Dempsey the truth when you could have ridden on." She paused. "I like you, Harvey Graves." He was smiling, which was something she had not seen him do fully until now, a wide-open smile that changed his whole face, that showed the man he would be when he stopped being careful all the time. "I like you too, Della Grayson," he said. "I have been liking you since you said my name in Farley's store and made it sound like a perfectly ordinary thing." She laughed, which was a sound like water, and then he kissed her again, briefly and warmly, and they both understood that something had begun, and that it was the kind of thing that does not require a great deal of ceremony to be real. Summer came to Calico Flats with its full weight, the sky enormous and white with heat in the afternoon, the red earth baking and the cottonwood casting its shade across the boarding house yard, where Harvey had taken to sitting in the evenings. He was still working at the Dempsey Ranch 3 days a week. Thomas had offered him a more permanent position, and Harvey had accepted it, and he had begun to put down what felt like roots, or at least the beginning of roots, the preliminary threads that attach a person to a place. He had a drawer in the room with the good window where he kept his things. He had begun to know which boards on the stairs creaked. He knew that Mrs. Baxter's daughter, whose name was June, came on the last Sunday of every month to take her mother to dinner at the hotel, and that Mrs. Baxter always wore her green dress for these occasions. He knew that Edmund Price taught school 5 days a week, and came home on Fridays looking exhausted and philosophical in equal measure, and that he could be revived by a cup of strong coffee and a conversation about the Mexican-American War, which was his particular historical enthusiasm. He knew Della's routines the way you know the rhythms of a house you have chosen. He knew she was up before him, which was saying something, because he rose early. He knew she baked bread on Mondays and Thursdays. He knew the particular sound of her boot heels on the kitchen floor when she was moving quickly through the morning, efficient and certain. He knew she sang sometimes when she thought no one could hear, low and not entirely on pitch but full of genuine feeling, and that the song she went back to most often was an old hymn about rivers and crossing over that had nothing in it that was sentimental except the melody itself. They walked together in the evenings when the heat had dropped to something bearable. Sutter Lane, then the main street, then sometimes out to the edge of town where the land opened up into the wide flat distance that was always somehow both empty and full in the territory, full of sky, full of the particular quality of light that came off red earth at the end of the day. They talked. They talked about everything, the way people do when they have found someone they can actually talk to, which is less common than it should be and worth treating with care when you find it. Harvey told her about East Texas, the pine forests and the clay soil that was nothing like the territory soil, and his mother who read Whitman and his father who was a hard man but not a mean one, who worked cattle and had opinions about the right way to do things that Harvey had sometimes resented and had come to understand only after he was grown. Della told him about growing up in the territory with Ellis Grayson, who was a gentle man and a curious one, who had taught her to read from a Bible and a surveyor's almanac, because those were the books he had, and who had believed firmly that a woman who could read and think and do figures was not going to be at anyone's mercy in this world. He was right, Harvey said. He was right about most things, Della said. He was less right about his health. He thought he could work through the chest ailment and he could not. You must have missed him very much, Harvey said. I still miss him, Della said. But missing someone is not the same as being defeated by missing them. He would not have wanted that and I would not have wanted it for myself. Harvey was quiet a moment, looking at the horizon where the last orange light was fading. My mother would have liked you, he said. She had an appreciation for women who knew their own minds. Did she know her own mind? Della asked. She did, he said. She married my father, which was a choice that required it. Della laughed and took his arm, which she had begun to do on their evening walks in the way that two people take each other's arms when they have stopped pretending that they might not, and they walked the last block back toward the boarding house with the stars coming out above them. There was a moment in early July that Harvey would think about for the rest of his life. It was a Sunday, and the boarding house was quiet. Mrs. Baxter had gone to her daughter's. Porter Finn was not due until Tuesday, and Edmund Price had gone to visit a colleague in the next town. Della had made a simple midday meal, and they ate it at the kitchen table, which was smaller and more intimate than the supper table in the dining room, and afterward she poured more coffee and neither of them moved to get up and go to their respective tasks, and the kitchen had the Sunday quality of time that does not demand anything of you. Harvey had his mother's Whitman book on the table. He had not quite meant to bring it down, but it had been in his coat pocket as usual. Read me something, Della said. He looked at her. She was sitting across from him with her coffee cup in both hands and her elbows on the table, entirely comfortable, entirely present. He opened the book. He read her Song of the Open Road, his voice low and careful at first and then easier as the poem moved, The words about the open air and the long road ahead, about the profound lesson of reception, about what it means to be ready and full of life. He read it straight through to the end without stopping, and when he finished the kitchen was very quiet for a moment. "Your mother had good taste," Della said softly. "She did," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over the open book over his hand. "Harvey," she said, "what do you want? In your life? Not what you have been trying to survive. What do you actually want?" He looked at her hand on his and then at her face. The sunlight through the kitchen window was making the gold in her eyes very clear. "I want to stay in one place long enough to know it," he said. "I want to have something that is mine, not just a saddlebag and a horse. I want to sit at a table like this on a Sunday morning and not be thinking about the next town." He paused. "I want to be here, Della." Her grip on his hand tightened. "Then be here," she said, fully, not waiting to leave, "here." "I am asking you," he said carefully, "whether here means what I think it means. Whether when you say be here you are saying what I think you are saying." Della Grayson, who did not dissemble and had not dissembled since she was old enough to understand that directness was more efficient and more kind than its alternative, looked at Harvey Graves across the kitchen table on a Sunday in July 1882 and said, "I am saying that I love you, Harvey. I am saying that I would like you to stay here in this house, and in this town not as a boarder but as mine, if that is what you want." Harvey Graves said, "It is everything I want." He stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, and he held her face in both his hands and looked at her for a long moment with his whole heart on his face. Nothing held back, nothing careful, just the open and astonished expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was traveling toward, and she looked back at him the same way. "Marry me," he said. She smiled, her full chest-deep smile. "I thought you would never get there," she said, and she kissed him. They were married on the first Saturday of August by the town minister, a man named Reverend Caleb Marsh, who performed the service in the small white church on the east side of Calico Flats, with the whole congregation in attendance. Because in a town of 400 people a wedding is an event, and this particular wedding had the additional quality of being one that people felt invested in, not least because Harvey Graves had become, over the summer, the kind of man a town feels better having in it. Thomas Dempsey and James Dempsey were there. Edwin Ferris was there, with his 2 grown sons and his daughter-in-law and a grandchild on someone's hip. Ray Holt stood up with Harvey. Della had asked June, Mrs. Baxter's daughter, to stand with her, and June had agreed with the enthusiasm of a woman who enjoys a wedding, and had a mother who had been providing running commentary on the romance for weeks. Edmund Price cried quietly and made no attempt to hide it. Porter Finn told a joke at the reception in the boarding house yard that was very nearly appropriate. Mrs. Baxter said, at a volume that carried to the far end of the yard, that she had known from the moment Harvey Graves walked in that he was the kind of man Della needed, and that she had told June exactly this on the occasion of his second supper. Harvey and Della stood in their own yard under the cottonwood tree, with cups of the punch that Mrs. Baxter had made using a recipe she described as her mother's, but which had a quantity of whiskey in it that suggested the recipe had been improved upon at some point. Harvey was wearing a clean coat and a new pair of boots, and he had his hat in his hand, which Della had told him she loved because it was so entirely him, the instinctive courtesy of it. "How does it feel?" she asked him quietly under the noise of the party. "Like the first day I do not have to think about leaving," he said. She took his hand, laced her fingers through his. "Good," she said. "Because I have a list of repairs for the coming autumn that requires a man with more mechanical ability than I have." He laughed out loud, which made several people nearby look over with pleasure, because Harvey Graves laughing fully was a sight worth seeing. The autumn of 1882 was the best Harvey Graves had spent in a decade. He settled into the life of Calico Flats and the boarding house and the Dempsey ranch with the whole-body relief of a man who has been carrying weight for a very long time and has been allowed to set it down. He learned the particular rhythms of the boarding house in a new way now, not as a guest observing them, but as part of them, one of the two people the house organized itself around. He helped Della with the fall preparations, putting up the garden, laying in wood for winter, replastering the section of the south wall that had cracked over the summer's heat. They had long evenings by the stove as the nights came earlier, reading and talking and sitting together in the comfortable way of two people who have chosen each other, and have the daily evidence of that choice all around them. Della had found two more Whitman collections at an estate auction in the fall, and had presented them to Harvey with the matter-of-fact pleasure of a woman who knows exactly the right gift. And Harvey had received them with the expression of a man who understands precisely what is being communicated, which is that she had been paying attention from the beginning. The Cord Ashby matter had one final echo in late September, when Harvey received a letter from an attorney in Albuquerque informing him that the federal case arising from the Redfield business had been formally closed, and that his record was officially clear in the territorial files. It was a piece of paper, a bureaucratic document. But Harvey held it for a long time at the kitchen table, and when Della came to read it over his shoulder, she put her arm around him from behind and held him, and he put his hand over her forearm. "It is done," she said. "It has been done for a while," he said, "but it is good to have the paper." She kissed the top of his head. "Put it in the tin box," she said, which was the tin box under the kitchen floorboards where Ellis Grayson had kept the savings and where Della now kept the important documents of her life. The Grayson title, Harvey's employment agreement at the Dempsey Ranch, their marriage certificate. Harvey folded the letter and put it in the tin box, and that was that. Burl Cott was convicted in territorial court in November of 1882 on charges of fraud, harassment, and conspiracy to commit unlawful seizure of property. He received 7 years. His 3 associates received lesser sentences. The territorial newspapers reported on it thoroughly, and the Calico Flats Gazette ran a piece that mentioned Harvey Graves and Sheriff Ray Holt and the documentation that had broken the case open, and Harvey read it with the equanimity of a man who has come to a different relationship with his own name in the world. Mrs. Baxter, who read the paper every morning at the breakfast table, held it up and announced that she had known from the beginning that Harvey Graves was an upstanding man, and that her judgment had once again been proven correct. No one disagreed. By winter, Della knew she was expecting. She told Harvey on a cold evening in December when the fire was high in the parlor stove, and they were sitting together on the settle that had been her father's, his arm around her and her head against his shoulder. And she said it in the same direct and certain way she said everything, looking up at him with her clear, warm eyes. Harvey Graves, who had been broken open by his name in a general store in the spring and had been opening wider ever since, went very still for a moment and then pulled her closer, his face against her hair. "Della," he said, which was the word he came to when ordinary language did not reach. "Are you pleased?" she asked, because she was a practical woman and she believed in asking the actual question. "I am so pleased," he said, "that I do not have adequate words for it, and you know I usually have words." She laughed, her warm chest-deep laugh, and put her hand over his at her waist. They talked about it for a long time that evening, the practical things and the other things, the names and the room that would need a cradle, and the way the boarding house would accommodate a child, which Della was confident it would because boarding houses and children had coexisted in the territory since the territory began. Harvey said he wanted the child to grow up knowing the cottonwood tree, which was the kind of thing he said sometimes that cracked Della open in the very same way she had cracked him open, with the simple, surprising weight of it. "Of course they will know the cottonwood tree," she said. "It will be the first tree they climb." Edmund Price, upon being informed, shook Harvey's hand formally and then shook it again, and said he was very glad. Mrs. Baxter cried with unambiguous happiness and told everyone in Calico Flats within the week. Thomas Dempsey, brought over a carved cradle that had held 3 generations of Dempsey children and said it was theirs as long as they needed it. Edwin Ferris's daughter-in-law, whose name was Rosa and who had become a friend to Della over the summer, brought a quilt she had made in the territory pattern that was all ochre and rust and a deep blue. The winter was hard, but the boarding house was warm and Della was well, and Harvey was present in the way that matters, the daily present, the there, when you reach for them present. He stayed awake later than she did as the winter deepened, often sitting by the stove with the Whitman or with the Calico Flats Gazette, and more than once Della came downstairs in the night to find him simply sitting, looking at the fire, and when she asked him what he was thinking, he said he was thinking about how much could change in a year. "A year ago in December I was in a town in Colorado that I do not particularly remember," he said, "working a fence line for a man who did not know my name. And now," she said. "And now," he said, looking at her where she stood in the firelight in her nightgown with her dark hair loose over her shoulders, carrying his child, standing in the house that was both of theirs. "I'm the most fortunate man I know." She came and sat beside him on the settle and tucked her feet up and leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they sat together in the warm quiet of the house, while the wind moved around the eaves outside and the fire made its small sounds. Their son was born in June of 1883, in the room with the good window, on a morning when the cottonwood was in full summer leaf, and the early light made patterns on the wall. Ray Holt's wife, who was the town's experienced midwife, attended, and Harvey stayed as close as was useful and moved back when he was in the way, which he did without being told because he was a man who was good at reading a room. When it was done and Della had the infant in her arms and was looking at him with the absolute focused expression of a mother meeting her child, Harvey came to the bedside and looked at the small, serious face of his son. "He looks like he has opinions already," Harvey said. Della laughed, exhausted and shining. "He comes by that honestly," she said. They named him Ellis Harvey Graves, for Della's father and for Harvey himself, which was Della's idea, and which Harvey received with the particular quality of silence that means a man is feeling too much to speak immediately. Ellis Harvey Graves was a sound and healthy boy who demonstrated from the earliest weeks that he had indeed inherited opinions. He was vocal about them. He was interested in everything and afraid of nothing. By the time he was 8 months old, he had made his views about the cottonwood tree known, by attempting to reach it from the grass with a focus that made Thomas Dempsey laugh until he had to wipe his eyes. Calico Flats received the Graves family in the full, easy way that communities receive people who have put down roots and earned their place. Harvey was on the town council by the following spring, a fact that he approached with the same steady seriousness he brought to everything. He was not a man who sought prominence, but he was a man who understood that the structures of a community require people willing to work them, and he had lived enough in places where those structures had failed to know what happened when no one tended them. He had a conversation with Ray Holt in the spring of 1884 about the situation of the Apache communities in the region, which had been a subject Harvey had been thinking about since he came to the territory. The displacement and the injustices visited on those communities were a matter of federal policy that operated with a brutality that Harvey Graves, who had put his badge down over the injustice of Cord Ashby's land scheme, could not look at without the same core-deep discomfort. He said so to Ray Holt and to the town council, and he said it in the plain language of a man who meant it. And he said that Calico Flats, while it could not undo federal policy, could conduct itself with fairness in its own transactions and its own territory, and that this meant both acknowledging the history of the land they occupied and treating every person who came through the town with equal dignity. Not everyone on the council agreed. There were voices that expressed the common prejudices of the era, with the confidence of men who had never been asked to examine them. Harvey listened to these voices and then said what he thought, without heat but without yield, and some of what he said landed and some of it did not, but he said it, and saying it mattered. Della heard about this from Edmund Price, who had been at the meeting. She came to Harvey that evening in the yard, where he was splitting wood in the last of the light, and she told him what Edmund had told her. "You know, half the council thinks you are a troublemaker," she said. "Half the council knows I am right," he said, setting another piece of wood on the block. "That is not the same half," she said, but she was smiling. "No," he agreed, "but it will be eventually." She leaned against the fence and watched him work. Ellis was asleep upstairs with his fist curled beside his face in the way he slept, and the evening was soft and the cottonwood was making its evening sound. "I married a good man," she said. Harvey set down the axe and turned to look at her. "You are the reason I got to be one," he said simply. She shook her head. "You were one before I found you. You just needed someone to say your name out loud." They looked at each other across the yard in the evening light. "Come inside," she said. "I have supper on." He came inside. The years moved through Calico Flats with the pace of a life that is actually being lived, full and varied, not easy but good. Harvey continued at the Dempsey Ranch, and by 1885 had a partial stake in the operation, which Thomas Dempsey had offered him as recognition of what Harvey had done for the ranch in the cod affair, and as acknowledgement of the fact that Harvey Graves was the kind of man you wanted holding a stake in something you cared about. Della's boarding house remained the center of their domestic life, filled with the rotating company of travelers and permanents that made a boarding house both a business and a kind of ongoing social experiment. Mrs. Baxter died peacefully in the winter of 1884 at the age of 72, in her green dress, after Sunday dinner at her daughter's house, which was by any measure a good death, and the boarding house was quieter for a while in the particular way of places that have lost a large personality. But life replenishes, and new people came, and the table continued to have its nightly conversations that Della managed with the easy authority of a woman who knows the value of a table where people can actually speak. Porter Finn continued to arrive on Tuesdays and depart on Thursdays with his jokes and his dry goods and his indefatigable good cheer. Edmund Price became the schoolmaster that Calico Flats would remember for a generation, strict, passionate about history, genuinely invested in his students, and almost completely hopeless at taking care of himself domestically, which Della addressed by absorbing him into the household in the manner of someone who simply continues to feed a person until it becomes a habit. In the late summer of 1885, Della told Harvey she was expecting again, and he responded in much the same way he had responded the first time, very still, very warm, reaching for her. "Two," he said. "Two," she confirmed. Their second child was a girl, born in the early spring of 1886, sturdy and loud, and from her first hour in the world absolutely certain about what she wanted. They named her Me Ellis Graves, Me for no particular reason except that it had been Harvey's mother's middle name, and it suited the small, imperious person who had arrived so emphatically into their lives. Ellis, who was nearly 3 at his sister's arrival and had opinions about everything, had opinions about me too. His primary opinion in the first weeks was that she was very loud and that something should be done about it. His secondary opinion, arrived at around the 4th week, was that she was the most interesting thing in the house and should be watched constantly. He appointed himself her official watcher with a gravity that made Harvey cover his mouth with his hand to keep from laughing. "He is going to be just like you," Della said, watching Ellis stand guard over the cradle with his small arms folded. "God help everyone," Harvey said. She leaned against him in the kitchen doorway, his arm around her, both of them watching their son watch their daughter, and the morning light came through the window over the cottonwood, and the house was warm and full and exactly itself. Della looked at Harvey's face in profile, the face she had learned the way you learn terrain when you have walked it 1,000 times, all its features mapped and dear. "Harvey," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. She looked up at him. "The morning in Farley's store," she said. "When you came in, everyone else was looking at the floor, and I looked at you and I thought, here is a man worth looking at. Here is a man who needs someone to look at him directly." She paused. "I did not know then how right I was." Harvey looked down at her. "I did not know what it would do to me," he said. "You saying my name. I did not know how much I had needed someone to say it like it was just a name." "It is just a name," she said. "It is a good name. It belongs to a good man." He kissed her then, in the kitchen doorway with the morning coming in and their son standing guard and their daughter asleep in the Dempsey cradle. A real kiss, warm and full. The kiss of two people who have been kissing each other for 4 years and have not yet exhausted the meaning of it. Ellis made a sound of decided disapproval at the display, which broke them both into laughter, and me, apparently sensing that she was missing something, woke up and added her voice to the proceedings. It was a Wednesday morning in Calico Flats, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1886, and it was the most ordinary and most extraordinary thing in the world. Harvey Graves had come to the territory with a name nobody would speak aloud, had arrived in a town that watched the dust rather than watch him, had ridden down a main street with the particular weight of a man whom history has made into a thing to be avoided rather than a person to be known. He had come carrying everything and having nothing, and he had been met by a woman who stood in a general store doorway with a flour sack over her shoulder, and said his name like it was the most natural word in the English language. He had broken open. There was no other way to say what had happened in Farley's store when Della Grayson said Harvey Graves without flinching. Something that had been sealed by years of leaving and looking at the backs of people's heads had cracked along its sealed seam and let in the air and then the light. And he had followed that light down Sutter Lane to a boarding house with a good cottonwood tree and a woman who put her hand over his at the kitchen table and looked at him directly and said "I love you" like it was a fact that had always been true and had simply been waiting for the appropriate moment to be stated. There were things that did not resolve cleanly, because life in the territory did not resolve cleanly. The injustices visited on the Apache communities did not end, because Harvey Graves spoke about them at a town council meeting. The law moved slowly, and the federal government moved in directions that served its own interests, and Harvey knew this, and kept saying what he thought and kept conducting himself according to what he believed was right, which was all that one man in one town could do, but which was not nothing. He had learned the lesson of Redfield, which was not that fighting injustice would always work, but that not fighting it was its own kind of cost. His letter to the governor's office about fair treatment of native workers who came through Calico Flats for seasonal work resulted in a terse reply that acknowledged receipt and nothing more, but he wrote again the following year, and Edmund Price wrote with him, and eventually a small thing shifted in the way the territorial office handled complaints from that quarter, which was not enough but was not nothing. The Dempsey ranch thrived. James Dempsey married a woman from the neighboring town who was exactly as capable and clear-eyed as James needed her to be, and Harvey stood up with him at the wedding the same way Ray Holt had stood up with Harvey. Thomas Dempsey, old and satisfied, died in 1887 with his ranch intact and in good hands, and with the full knowledge that it had not been taken from him, which was the thing he had feared most. And Harvey sat with James that night and they talked about Thomas until the whiskey was gone, and the stars were very bright, and both men felt the weight of what they had been given by an old man who had trusted them. In the fall of 1887, Harvey walked Della out to the edge of town on an evening when the territory sky was doing everything it could do with color, all its oranges and pinks and the deep blue-green that came in the east before full dark. And they stood at the place where the town ended and the open land began, the place where you could see for 30 miles in every direction and understand why people had been coming to this country and refusing to leave it since before anyone had called it a territory. "Do you remember what you said to me?" he asked. "The evening I told you I wanted to stay, but I did not know how long." "I told you to stay and see how the land felt under your feet when you stopped thinking about leaving," she said. "How does it feel?" he asked, which was the question she had asked him at their wedding, and which he had been storing to return to her. Della Grayson Graves looked at the 30 miles of open territory, and the sky, and the lights of Calico Flats behind them, and the hand of the man she had looked at directly when everyone else was looking at the floor. "It feels like mine," she said. "It feels like ours." Harvey put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood there until the last light was gone, and the stars were up in their full desert brilliance. The sky so clear and enormous that it was almost something you could hear, and the town behind them was lit and warm, and holding their children and their friends, and the cottonwood tree in the yard, and the tin box under the kitchen floor with its documents of a life that had been claimed and kept. Ellis Harvey Graves would grow up to be a man who read Whitman and knew how to do figures and had strong opinions about fairness, the kind of man who comes from a household where those things are ordinary. He would become a territorial lawyer in Albuquerque, which Harvey received with the pride of a man who had cause to believe in lawyers and what good ones could do. Ellis Graves would grow up to do something none of them had entirely predicted, which was that she developed a gift for horses that surpassed anything Harvey had encountered in 30 years around livestock. A gift so natural and complete that by the time she was 10 she was the person Thomas Dempsey's son came to when a difficult animal needed handling, and the horses simply came to her with the confidence of creatures that recognize someone who understands them absolutely. But these were things to come. On this fall evening in 1887, Harvey and Della Graves walked back to their house in Calico Flats, through the gate, past the cottonwood tree, in through the door, where the warmth met them and the lamp was burning, and somewhere upstairs Ellis was explaining something to me with great seriousness, and me was responding with a sound that suggested she had a different view entirely. Harvey hung his hat on the hook beside the door, the way he always did, the same hook he had been hanging it on since August of 1882, the hook Della had put there because she had known he was going to need one and had put it at the right height without asking, because she paid attention. He watched her cross the kitchen and stir whatever was on the stove and push the loose hair back from her face with her wrist the way she did, and the lamp made her warm, and the kitchen was warm, and the sounds from upstairs were the sounds of their children being themselves in the unself-conscious way of children who have always been safe. Harvey Graves, who had come to the territory with a name nobody would speak aloud, stood in his kitchen in his home in his town and felt the land solid under his feet, felt himself rooted and known and exactly where he was supposed to be. And he was, for the first time in longer than he could properly remember, entirely at peace. Della looked over her shoulder from the stove and found him standing there looking at her. "What?" she said, smiling at whatever was on his face. "Nothing," he said, "everything." She laughed and turned back to the stove. "Come and set the table," she said. "Supper is nearly ready." Harvey Graves took the plates down from the shelf and set the table for 4, which was exactly the right number of places for the life he had. And the evening came in around the windows of the boarding house on Sutter Lane, and the cottonwood moved in the last of the day's wind, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was the whole world.